Well, here we are in John chapter 21. And it seems almost a bit anticlimactic because remember what we said last week. Last week, the end of chapter 20 almost seems like the end of the book. I mean, it almost seems like, in fact, if you remember, I'm of the opinion, and I could be horribly wrong here, but I'm of the opinion that that was probably originally intended to be the end. And then John came back and either right away wrote an epilogue, chapter 21, or maybe at a slightly later date wrote an epilogue and tacked it on. And so one of the questions in your lesson even compares the end of last chapter to the end of 21, and they have some similarities to them. They're both very fitting for the end of book type statements. So just a little bit of context there. And as we dive into chapter 21, there's a little bit that happens here. So it's not like, it's like nothing happens in chapter 21. What we find is 7 of the 11 disciples are together for this episode. And interesting, if you look at the names, there's Nathanael of Cana listed in verse 2. Nathanael of Cana. Well, when was the last time we heard about him? Well, in the book of John, the last time was back in chapter 1, verse 45, when they started gathering all the disciples together. Remember, Nathanael was part of that. And then he just disappears, and then he shows up. So it's kind of an interesting bookend. Some people think, if you read your commentaries, some people think that Bartholomew, who ends up on the list of disciples in other places, may be this Nathanael character. So that may be an easy solve to that mystery if that's a correct answer. If not, here he is. Hey, Nathanael. All right. And I think we have a son, Nathanael. Do we spell it this way? No. It's, yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's what it was. Yes, my mom spelled it this way when we greeted our child, and we had to correct her. That's right. And I totally remember that now. So that's the problem when you call him Nate all the time. It's a little bit easier to spell. Okay, so and I'm going to be pointing out a couple weird things as we go. You probably noticed them. He names all these disciples, including sons of Zebedee. Do you notice that? Now, what I'm going to be suggesting is John is likely the last gospel written. It's the most unique gospel because the other are more synoptics, right? They're more similar. Sons of Zebedee that's a brand new term in John's gospel. We're familiar with it because the synoptics all use it to describe who? James and John, the author of this gospel. Here, John pulls out sons of Zebedee in his epilogue as if you know who that is. What's he assuming? You've read one of the other accounts, right? So I find that interesting. He dovetails another time as well that I'll mention here pretty quick. But then at the end of this list in verse 2, and I mean, he's named all these people, and 2 other of his disciples were there. I mean, he almost takes as many words as he could to just give their names, right? I think that's funny. I don't have an answer for that. I just love it. Unexpected, right? So there you go.
Who are they? Who are the other 2 disciples?
Exactly. Who are they? Well, they're 2 other disciples that were there. Yeah. I mean, we absolutely don't know. I'll guess. No, I won't. I have no idea. Yeah. So here's a question. Why wouldn't all the disciples be together in this account? Yeah, we don't know that either. I mean, it's an honest question, right? We can guess. They didn't like fishing. They were tired. Whatever. Maybe they're back in town. I don't know. But no commentary as to why. But here they are, 7 of the 11, right, that are left. So, because Judas doesn't get replaced until Acts. Okay, good. So as we move through, I mentioned dovetailing. He expects that you've possibly become familiar with one of the other Gospels. And we see that with this first interaction Jesus has. He's on the shore, right? And as he's on the shore, he calls out to the boat and asks them to cast the net on the other side, which we as gospel readers, we hopefully pick up on that because we've read another gospel where a similar, do you remember where that is? That's in Luke, right? Luke 5, 3 through 11. John and Peter were there again. That was one of your questions. You kind of went and looked at that. And they're again present here in this boat. And we looked at, and it's important, I think, to see in the Luke passage, what is Peter's response in that episode? I'm going to be suggesting that the author, John, the way he writes this episode, he's giving us contextual clues that he expects us to pick up on from other stories and marry them in with this story, okay? So he's asking us to do a bit of work as readers. So when he calls in the Luke passage, John and Peter were there. They get this miraculous catch, and what is the response of Peter? Here it is in verse 8. When Simon Peter saw what? The amount of fish, right? Saw that this was just an unusual event. This was not normal. He had grown up a fisherman and he's never seen this. No question in his head, maybe for the first time, that this is uniquely unique, right? What's his response? He fell down at Jesus' feet and he says, "Go away." Can you imagine saying this to Jesus? Okay. But this is Peter, right? "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." I think it's a heartfelt feeling that he's experiencing, right? He honestly feels his sinfulness in the presence of very God himself. And maybe he's realizing that for the first time. For amazement has seized him and all his companions. Who are all the companions? Sons of Zebedee and then his brother, right? So, that's the Luke passage. And I think it's important that when John retells, tells a second story with similar circumstances, he expects that we know more than, oh, this happened before, but we also know Peter's response. Because what are we tracking in John's story? We're tracking Peter's response, right? So it's important that we understand Peter's background to fully understand what Peter is doing. I'm going to probably challenge your thinking a little bit as we work through this passage because, surprise, surprise, I've got a different way to read it. So can't finish without something like that. So when Peter heard that John had put this together back in the John passage, and John says to him, "Hey, it's the Lord," verse 7. So John's putting this together before Peter does. They see the miraculous catch. John does. John says, "Oh, this has happened before," right? This is a triggering event. What's a trigger, right? It's an event that you've experienced something before, and so when something similar like that happens again, where do you go? You go right back to that event. But it's not just in memory oftentimes. When we, in our culture, we talk about triggering, is it a positive thing often? No, it's usually a negative. So let's think about this as a triggering event for Peter. I don't know if you've ever thought about it that way, because it's not often taught that way, but miraculous catch. What's Peter's reaction the first time he saw this? We just talked about it. He was terrified. He was terrified. He realized his sinfulness. Oh, well, that's a context here, isn't it? What was Jesus' statement to them the first time? Fear not. Don't be afraid. Okay? He realized everybody. What's Jesus' statement this time? Well, we'll take a look at that as we get to it. John realizes what's going on. And he looks over at Peter, the other guy who was in the first account with him, and he says, "I know who that is." And Peter is triggered, I'm going to suggest. Either positive or negative, right? We can assume he's triggered because everybody, they're putting this together as we go. And then what happens? Well, what's his response? The way it reads is he puts on, and I think this is, we need to read it for what it says, because I don't think we've been trained to do that. Therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved, verse 7, said to Peter, "It's the Lord." So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, his first response was to put on his outer garment because he was stripped down. Now, some people say this is completely naked. Some people say he just had his underwear on because he'd stripped down for work. I tend to think that in the Jewish culture, in the Greek culture, totally naked's fine. People do that all the time in gymnastics and all that stuff. In the Jewish culture, from what I've read, they're a little more conservative, and I likely think he's near naked, but he's got his underwear on. What's his first response when he finds out, when he puts it together? He covers his nakedness. Okay? Do we have another story in the Bible anywhere where somebody realizes their sin and covers their nakedness? Yeah. Now, I'm not 100% sure that that's what we're supposed to be thinking here as readers, but that's what I'm thinking. And it's not been taught this way to me, so I'm just trying to read what does the text say, because every sermon I've ever heard on this, and likely you yourself, he puts on his outer garment and throws himself into the sea. Why? What's his purpose? Because he wants to go see Jesus. He wants to get there first, right? That's the way it's always been taught to me. And that, at one level, that makes total sense. And if that's exactly what was going on, that's awesome. But the text doesn't necessarily say that. And so let's just ask, what is the text saying? When Peter sees a work of God and realizes he's in the presence of God, what was his first reaction the first time? He realized his sinfulness. Likely he's triggered into a same response. Does he have a more recent episode of realizing his sinfulness? Of course he does. 3 denials of very God himself, right? He realizes his sinfulness and he throws himself into the sea. Do we have an episode or a story in the Bible about somebody being thrown into the sea who was not following God's plan? Yeah, there's a story in the Old Testament called Jonah, right? And he doesn't throw himself in, but practically he does. Because people are coming to him saying, "What did you do?" And he said, "It's my fault." Right? They throw him into the sea. The sea in biblical ideas too is known as a place of chaos and evil. Even though this is the Lake of Galilee, it's translated the Sea of Galilee, it's referred to as a sea. It's a big body of water. And so there's a little bit of that context coming in, possibly from the Old Testament as well. And so where do we go from here? Okay, so let's ask, where are we first? He's, the way I'm reading it, covering his nakedness. He's throwing himself into the sea. Where does it say he threw himself into the sea so he could swim to shore faster? Well, it does say in verse 8. Let's take a look at verse 8. But the other disciples came in the little boat. Now, we get some help from the NIV translation. Does anybody have the NIV? Yeah, what does it say in verse 8? The other disciples
followed into the boat and towards the net full of fishes.
Yes, they followed in the boat. The NIV decided to translate the verb there as follow, which suggests what? That they're behind who? Peter, who's swimming ahead to try and get to Jesus. The only problem is the Greek word there is not followed. John knows the Greek word for follow. He uses it several times. In fact, follow me he uses later, and it's not this word. The word here is they came to the shore in the boat. I'm going to suggest to you that's in contrast to Peter, who came to the shore not in the boat, which could be him swimming ahead, but it could be that he is just covering his nakedness. Let me take you back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve realized their nakedness. What do? They cover themselves, and then they hide. That's interesting. Now, this is all playing in typologically really well, but does that what the text is really allowing us to read? So that's a great question, so let's keep going on. The other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away. That "for" is a little inserted explanation. If you take that inserted explanation out, verse 8 says, "But the other disciples came in the little boat, dragging the net full of fish." Why did they drag the net full of fish? Because they were only about 100 yards away. This is a football field, okay? It's really, literally, it's 200 cubits, but oftentimes they give it in terms that we understand as far as distances. So I'm a swimmer. If I have to swim the length of a football field, and I have my swimsuit on, the last thing I want to do is what? Put my full set of clothes on and swim to shore, knowing that the boat is coming right behind me, right? So what's going on here? I think John's giving us clues, and he's dovetailing with not just other Gospels, but he's dovetailing with all of Scripture. And they're 100 yards, which is, I'm a swimmer, and 100 yards, a football field's a long way to swim, okay? So, and if you're in full clothing, it's a really long way to swim, right? Now, he may have been just a great swimmer, and he trained in his clothing. Maybe that's what's going on. And I'm okay if that's what's going on, okay? I'm just asking, what does the text actually say? So they dragged the net full of fish. Now, if Peter actually jumped in and swam to shore ahead of the boat, and the boat followed, like the NIV would suggest in their translation, what would you expect next? You would expect Peter to be on shore with Jesus, having met him and talked with him, waiting for the boat to come. Okay, let's just read. So when they got out on the land, they, plural, right? Who's they? We assume it's the other 6 because Peter's jumped out of the boat, okay? But is that an assumption? Does it say Peter's not a part of this group? Not yet. And let's just keep reading. So when they got out on the land, maybe 6, maybe 7, they saw a charcoal fire already laid and fish placed on it and bread. Charcoal fire, that's interesting. There's only one other time in all of the New Testament that charcoal fire is mentioned. Do you remember?
So where do they use words?
It's in the book of John. Charcoal fire is Peter around the charcoal fire when he's doing his denials. Do you remember? There's a charcoal fire. It's specifically mentioned as such. And if you do a word search in the Greek, 2 places in the entirety of the New, it's not a common word, but John brings it up here again. Okay, so if I haven't convinced you yet that Jesus is triggering Peter, okay, think about it. Miraculous catch, sinful man, covers his nakedness, hides himself possibly. I'm suggesting maybe he jumped on the other side of the boat, away from the shore, to hide. Now, am I reading into that? Yes, but is that an option in the text? Let's consider. And then, when they eventually get to shore, what does Peter find? Trigger, right? I mean, if he's not convinced of his sinfulness yet, okay, Jesus is just setting the stage, and John is painting the picture for us to be able to see this along with Peter, and he expects us, I think, to follow along as he goes. So when they got out on the land, they saw the charcoal fire already laid, fish, bread, and Jesus said to them, who? Well, maybe 6 if there's only 6 coming out of the boat. Maybe 7 if he jumped on the other side. It allows for both. He said to them, bring some of the fish which you, plural you, all of you, have now caught. And then verse 11. Simon Peter went up and drew the net to the land. He went up. He ascended is another way to translate that. So some commentators say this means he went from shore, from where Jesus was, because he swam to Jesus. He went back down to shore, went up into the boat, and brought the fish in. That's what most of your commentators are going to say. This is went up. He ascended. This is the next mention of Simon Peter after he's thrown himself into the sea. What's the next thing? The next thing Peter does is he ascends up. Out of where? If he's on shore, he's not going up. He'd be going down into the water to go get the fish, right? And drag them up. Simon Peter went up. He ascended. I'm suggesting maybe it's up out of the water from where he had been hiding, and he drew the net to land. Why? Because everybody else had gotten out of the boat, and they're all seeing Jesus. And where's Peter? If this is the way you're supposed to read it. He's, yeah, a lot of commentators will say that too, about how strong of a person he would have had to have been. Yeah. He drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153, and although there were so many, the net was not torn. So, 153. So anytime you get a number in the Bible, you get people out there that try and figure out what it means, right? So there have been all kinds of guesses on this throughout the ages. You've probably heard some of them. 2 that I've heard most recently, Jerome, early church writer after the time of the apostles, concluded that there were 153 countries in the world when this was written, and so one fish represents one country, and in this way the entire world will be caught in Jesus' net. Is that beautiful? Yeah, the problem is the source the source that Jerome quoted actually said there was 157 countries, and Jerome changed the number to 153 to make it work. So I applaud his efforts, but I'm not sure that's exactly the way we should go. Other one you may have heard that I think is a favorite of some is if you square the number 12, you get 144. And if you square the number, 12 is the number of the, yeah. And if you square the number 3, you get 9. And if you add 12 squared and 3 squared, you get the number of fish in the catch. So, I mean, it should be clear to everyone exactly what that means, so I won't expound upon it. Let me just say that I think somebody counted the fish, and it was an unusually large number of fish. Because they had the number, they put it in the text. And John remembered it, right? Because he was there. He was probably the one that counted the last fish, right? So that's the way I'm reading it, at least. Yeah, maybe Peter had started the count a little early. Yeah. So again, I'm not trying to tell you how to read this. What I'm trying to do is paint an option that the text allows, and maybe take away a deeply rooted idea that you have been given that maybe the text allows as well. But there's a lot of imagery there that I'm seeing, biblical imagery that John is dovetailing into this story that might suggest, and if you think about it, especially with Peter's responses, that when he actually gets to Jesus, how he responds 3 times and all of this, and he becomes offended, and okay, it might be that we've read that incorrectly. In fact, how would I have responded? That's really what I'm asking. We know that Peter just wears his emotions on his sleeve, and he runs to things, and he does things impulsively. We see that in other parts of Scripture. And I think both of these options would explain Peter's personality. Either jumping in and going to, I skipped one. There was another episode of Peter on the water with Jesus. Do you remember? Yeah, he thought he was going to walk. But do you remember what the response was when they saw Jesus walking on the water? The disciples' response? They were terrified. And what was Jesus' response? Fear not, it is I. Right? All 3 episodes, I think you've got terrified people because that flows, right? That flows. All right. None of the disciples in verse 12. Here's another funny thing, or I find curious. Jesus says, "Come have breakfast," and then it says in verse 12, "None of the disciples ventured to question him, 'Who are you?' Because they knew it was the Lord." It's just written strangely, isn't it? It suggests to you that they did have some sort of a question in their mind, but so possibly there's he looked slightly differently, or there's something different going on, or this wouldn't have been, if you clearly see who it is, they're up on him now. I mean, they're face to face. They didn't venture to question, "Who are you?" because they knew. That's a weird little statement that he includes. "And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish likewise." Here's the question that literally nobody is asking about this chapter. You ready? Where did Jesus get the bread? I mean, did he just did he buy it? If he bought it, where did he get the money? Did he pick up? Did he catch a fish and money in the mouth of the fish? Okay, nobody's asking this question because it doesn't matter. Okay, let me just point that out. But just wanted to let you know that that's the question. Then we get to this, "Do you love me more than these?" Okay, so we get this Jesus talking to Peter interaction. And you've heard this in a sermon at some point. And you know that the word for love is what? Well, it changes. If you've heard the sermons, it changes. So Jesus is using agape the first 2 times. Peter is responding with phileo, brotherly type love. Philadelphia, city of brotherly love. That's where we get that. And then the last time, what does Jesus do when he asked him, "Do you love me?" We see it love in English, but we know Greek, it's phileo. He goes down to Peter's level of commitment at the time, and Peter's offended that he had to ask the 3rd time. I already told you twice. I mean, okay. And he responds with phileo, the brotherly love, the last time. We've all heard that sermon. So part of the problem with distinguishing those 2 words is this. John uses those 2 words in other places in his gospel, and he uses them almost synonymously everywhere else. There may be small nuances, but it's not the big difference of agape love versus brotherly love that you may have heard in a sermon. So, okay, that's one thing. But there's something else going on that you may not have noticed. Actually, your questions kind of led you there, so I'm going to try and tie it together. There's a bunch of synonyms going on in this interaction. And I'm going to suggest to you that the synonyms used for love are matching other synonyms that Jesus is doing. So I kind of highlighted it here in verse 15. After these 2 loves, agape, phileo, then Jesus says, "Tend my lambs." Tend and lambs. And then the second time, what does he say? Shepherd, which is kind of like tending, right? Shepherding and tending. Shepherd my sheep. He was into alliteration. No, because that's English and he wasn't. Okay, never mind. Shepherd my sheep. Tend lambs, shepherd sheep. Synonyms. Do you see it? What does he do the 3rd time? Tend. which is the first time, and sheep, which was the second response. So he marries two terms from, do you see how he's using synonyms and matching them together? And that's not it. So you've got the love synonyms, you've got the tending, shepherding synonyms, you've got the sheep, lamb synonyms, and you also have the word for know. You don't know this yet, unless you've looked behind the veil of the English language. But in verse 17, his response, you know all things, you know that I love you. It seems like that's the same word, but it's completely different Greek words that are in the response of Peter. There's synonyms going on throughout this interchange, these three verses. And I'm just going to suggest to you that possibly the synonym theme is more important than the agape phileo theme that you've heard sermons on more than likely. Now, it could be that I'm completely wrong, and if so, great. We'll admit it when I figure it out. So, that's what's going on there. Let me see if I've missed anything before we head on. Yeah. Nope, that's good. So we get to the end. Oh, we're on the home stretch here. We get to the end. And if all of John 21 is not an epilogue, these last few verses certainly are. It's really thought that John is including this because this is some weird language that's used in here. It's weird conversation. It's, in my opinion, a strange way to finish, except for the last couple verses, it's a strange way to finish this whole thing. When you were younger, you used to gird yourself. And so he's talking about death. He's talking about, well, what's going to happen to John and the whole thing. Well, we got to remember this. This was written, likely the last gospel written, okay? And it was, some of the disciples had died. Some were about to die. John would eventually die, but John would be the last to die. And John knows this. And so what's happening, we got to put ourselves in the readership of this original letter. What's happening is the apostles were getting further away from this episode of Jesus, right? This incarnation of Jesus. He's no longer here. We're now getting further away from the presence of the apostles. They are disappearing on us. And John anticipates this. And so I think the reason this information is included is not so much to say, here's the conversation Peter had with Jesus and it was really important to Peter. Here's the conversation Jesus had with Peter, and that's why it's really important to you, readers of my letter, because we apostles are not going to be here forever. But this thing is going forward without us. That's the message. Yeah. I missed something in the last. Should I? No. Yes. I'm going to go back. The last thing I was trying to remember up in the conversation between Peter and Jesus. We pause this emphasis on the Greek words and how they're synonyms, the way I pointed out. Another problem is that a lot of people haven't considered, Jesus probably wasn't speaking Greek in this conversation. He was probably speaking Aramaic. So all of the sermons that you've heard that expound upon agape versus phileo, the meaning of those two Greek words, it is very likely that Jesus didn't even say those words. But he said, possibly, Aramaic synonyms for love. So when John translated his Aramaic words into Greek, he's using synonyms to match what Jesus was doing in the conversation, but he's not matching the exact words. Does that make sense? That seems almost like a rabbit hole that we want to be careful going down because it almost seems like it's going to threaten the integrity of Scripture. And I've gone partway down that rabbit hole, and it doesn't. It doesn't, because translations prove to be effective, especially ones that are prompted by the Holy Spirit, right? So, That's the other thing that I forgot to mention, that I wanted to mention, but I was debating earlier today. So now that I think about it, my subconscious removed that because maybe I wasn't supposed to. So, okay, that's really a good way to finish. Really a good way to finish strong here. What's Jesus' message to Peter in these last? Peter, you're going to die. At other people's, Peter, you're going to get killed. You're not going to die a slow, graceful anything. Important for Peter to understand that, but also what? Important for John's original readership, who just possibly within months or years is going to hear of the story of Peter dying, right? So it's an important message in both settings. Another thing that Jesus, I think, is saying to Peter is, don't worry about other people and what I've called them to. Let's concentrate on you. And I think that's a great message for us today. I think we are in a culture that teaches us to worry about other people and what they're doing and how they look when they acted that way. And I think it's a good reminder as we get here to the end of the book, hey, it's focus on you. What have you been called to? Be ready for what God's calling you to, right? Now we have to operate within a community, and that's all fair and good. But we can get distracted sometimes and get wander away from what God might be calling us to do individually. And I think that's part of what Jesus was doing with Peter here. We finish with a follow me statement, similar to the first follow me that he gave this same person earlier when he first called him. So we end. Let's just read the last couple verses. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Well, way to throw something in right here. Who's the we? I mean, I don't know. So there's something interesting. The Greek manuscript originally, no spaces to conserve space on valuable writing material. So they scrunched all the words together, no punctuation, all capital letters. So a nightmare to try and figure out where the words are. Interestingly, the Greek word for we here, if you separate it in half, it can be I surely know. It could be a translation of this. Now, it's not the way the manuscripts have divided it, but if that is true, if that's the way it was supposed to be understood, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and I surely know that his testimony is true. Why? Because I'm him, right? Okay, so that would make more sense. That's my solution. If I'm wrong, I'll admit it later. Okay. But we, who's the we? I'm not quite sure. I don't know how to answer that. And there are also many other things. Great concluding, almost hyperbole, right? There are many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. It's a great statement. And that's the book of John. It's the last gospel written. John knows that we're approaching the end of the temple era. Temple will be gone soon. So he writes his gospel to point people to Jesus as the new temple. We've outlined that in our study. He knows that the end of the apostles' lives are approaching, so he lets us know that that's going to be okay. And he reassures his readers, it's going to be okay. Let's just move forward. Not around us as apostles, but around who? Around Jesus. Yeah. It's the same message for us in every generation sense. So we can receive that same message today. It's going to be okay. We're all going to die, but it's going to be okay. And let's move forward, not around any one person or group of people, because they will fail us, but let's move forward and be centered around Jesus because he is our salvation. Oh, It's a great message. Would love to thank a few people, like I did at the end of the Matthew study. I want to thank a few people here, not to go into great detail, but we've got some group leaders, Jim and Roseanne, and Jim and Lisa, and I would just like to give them a round of applause because they've put some time and effort into their study and their preparation to make sure that your groups go well. Julie, who's not here, who works here at the church as our bookkeeper, she has been the one that has altogether by herself done the extra links and excerpts. And so when you click on those and find benefit in them, be sure to thank Julie for those. And then Barbara, who I've mentioned in weeks past, who passed away a few weeks ago, just helped me immensely with the writing of the lessons. So that's sad still, right? Yeah, still sad. So, and I've got to let you know a little secret that Barbara and I had about, she was a Bible geek, okay? She and I would talk and we would just be speaking the same language. At the end, we would just nod and we knew what we were saying. You've heard of me talking about chiastic structure before, right? Okay, so chiastic structure it's based on a Greek letter, the chi, and it's like an X, and the idea is you build in a Jewish or Greek argument, you build towards a middle point, okay? And we see that throughout Scripture. We see that in extra biblical literature as well of the time. So I thought it to be a great idea during this book study to become, to my knowledge, the first and only teacher to chiastically wear his shirts through the entire book. And I shared this with Barbara, and every single week she was like, "Well, I saw it. You're following the pattern." So now you just need to go to the website and you need to see and scroll through and see where the chiastic center is, because I did something special, okay? And just know, this is my calling. This is when I die, I just hope that they say this about me, that he was the only.
So were you wearing this shirt on the first night?
This is John 1. John 1. Now, I had an intro week that doesn't follow, and I had a sermon that doesn't follow, but John 1 to John 21, which is an odd number. Whenever you have an odd number, it means you have a center. Go find the center. And see the hidden message. It's on page 153. No. Okay. Lastly is this. I've relied heavily on some people very much smarter than I am in preparation for this. One that I've listened to, there's a guy named Steve Gregg. He's got a website called thenarrowpath.com, thenarrowpath.com. He literally has verse-by-verse teaching on the entire Bible. And so I've been listening to him along the way. I don't agree with him on everything, but it's good to listen to somebody else that's done more research than you to see if you're missing something, right? So Steve Gregg, very helpful. I've never spoken to the man, but he's helped me immensely. Dr. Warren Gage, one of my professors in my doctoral program, the whole Old Testament imagery of the temple, everything, my sermon that I did, that's all from Warren Gage. I didn't make any of that up. I'm just repeating what he told me. And lastly, there's a guy in Florida by the name of Dr. Chip Bennett. GraceSarasota.com is his church's website. It's one of the fastest growing churches in the nation right now. And just periodically, he will send me text messages and phone calls just to encourage me. And oftentimes those things come at just the right time. You know how you get sometime they just pop up and there it is. So Chip Bennett as well, Dr. Chip Bennett. So I'm going to show him this, so I had to include that. And thank you. Thank you for being here. And thanks for putting the time in and studying and finishing strong for this lesson. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. So, yeah, very good. The book of John. Yeah.